Hey, welcome to my channel, Deciduous Snurb. My name is Kevin, and I'm going to show you how I air layer Japanese black pine, and how you can too, for bonsai, or even for landscape use. Japanese black pine, or pines in general, are known to be especially difficult, or even thought to be nearly impossible to air layer. And by doing this slightly different method of air layering, I have successfully rooted over a dozen branches over the last few years, and I would like to share this method with you. For those who do not know what air layering is, it is essentially a way of propagating or cloning trees and shrubs by forcing a branch to develop its own roots. This usually involves wounding a portion of the branch and providing ideal moisture to that wound long enough until it starts to form callus tissue and form roots. Given enough time, the branch should form enough of its own roots so that the branch can ultimately be removed and survive as a separate tree. This is my Japanese black pine garden tree, which is around 11 or 12 years old now. I originally bought it for bonsai 8 years ago, but it had some reverse taper at the base of the trunk. So a few years ago, I just decided to plant it as a garden tree and try getting some pieces to root from it for bonsai instead. I wasn't quite sure if this could be done with pine. After doing some research online, I stumbled upon a blog created by a man named George Muranaka, who has been very successful in propagating Japanese black pine in this particular way. So I credit this method to him, and I will have a link to his blog in the video description. I have never tried this method on any other pine yet. In theory, it should work on many double flush pines, or pines that will send out new shoots of growth if pruned at the correct time of year, such as Japanese black and red pine, pitch pine, and loblolly pine, for example. Okay, so here are some tools and supplies you will need for this. Pruners or shears, a sharp knife or a razor blade, plastic pots with a cut down the side, rooting hormone, chopped sphagnum moss or potting medium. I recommend adding perlite, a little aluminum wire, and some duct tape. Alright, getting started, you're going to want to make sure it's the right time of year, which is mid to late spring, right after the current year's growth or the candles have extended, but before the needles have fully elongated. Here for me in USDA Zone 6, it is usually mid to late May, or even early June might still work. Next, you can go ahead and select the branches you wish to air layer. For me, this works best with stems from last year's growth, which are normally 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch thick, or 0.7 to 2 centimeters thick. Trying this method with older, larger branches might work, but will likely take a lot longer to root, and anything much thinner could snap under the weight of the layer. Selecting stems of the appropriate thickness from last year's growth should ensure these air layers will be rooted and ready to remove by early to mid-autumn. Go ahead and cut this year's candles off, or this year's growth, on your selected branch. And don't worry, it will respond with a second flush of growth weeks later during the summer months. After that, remove all needles on the branch below the point you want roots, leaving about 4 to 7 inches of needles on top, which works well for bonsai. If you wanted a taller tree for a landscape, you could use the whole length of last year's growth, which sometimes can be a foot or two in length, so it's really just personal preference. Now take a knife or a razor and carefully cut 2 rings around the bark, directly below the remaining needles. You will want to cut just deep enough into the outer wood, usually no more than 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. Be very careful while doing this step and take your time, all while being mindful as to where your hands are. As you can see in this clip from a previous video, I was a little too eager with my grafting knife, and while cutting the rings, I cut right through the stem. Fortunately, I wasn't cut. The rings of bark should be about the same distance apart as the thickness of the branch, as a rule of thumb. Then, cut a line connecting the rings and peel off the bark as one entire piece, as well as the cambium, which is the thin green layer under the bark. This usually comes off pretty easily with pines. As with most air layers, try to make sure the cambium is fully removed by lightly scraping the wood or xylem, as I'm showing here in this clip from the previous year. It isn't entirely necessary for success, it's just good practice. Otherwise, there could be enough cambium left that isn't visible and could reconnect to the lower section and probably not result in roots. Here, I am doing a double air layer, which can be nice if you want to try making a double trunk bonsai, or just twice the amount of new trees. After removing the bark and the cambium layer, the next step will be to make some vertical cuts with your knife. Making 4 to 6 cuts all the way around evenly should work, or more if the branch is much thicker than this. Make sure you cut into the bark and down to the wood with your knife, but do this part slowly. The sap could actually cause the edge of the knife to slip and do some damage to either yourself or the air layer. So just take it slow and steady and try to be as precise as you can here. Prior to seeing Muranaka's blog on air layering, I had never heard of this vertical cut step before. It is mainly meant to fatten up the base of the layer once it fully roots and helps create taper for the tree. I think it helps with rooting as well, since the vertical cuts provide more surface area for rooting hormone to be absorbed, which you can see I'm applying right here with a paintbrush, making sure I apply it to the underside of the upper part of the cut and also the vertical cuts into the bark. In the example I saw in Muranaka's blog, he doesn't appear to use any rooting hormone, but I really think it helps get things started, especially when you have a limited growing season and you're trying to get these layers rooted as soon as possible before winter arrives. Next, take your pot that's split down the side and fit it around the branch. You're going to want the wound or the ringed area to be positioned so that it's about halfway down and in the center of the pot, like this. And what I like to do is take a wire or a zip tie of some sort to stop the pot from sliding down too far and potentially ruining the air layer. Sometimes the pot will be just tight enough around the branch and it will sort of secure itself, but I like to add something just in case. And double checking to make sure the ring of bark is in the center of the pot, take a twist tie, or you can even use duct tape to close the side of the pot. Using a twist tie or some sort of wire makes it more convenient for later on in the summer when you want to check for roots. At this point, you can start adding your sphagnum moss or whatever potting medium you have available to the pot. I recommend sphagnum moss because it's antibacterial, it holds moisture well, but at the same time provides some aeration. The moss I'm using has been chopped into smaller pieces and also has perlite fines added to provide extra aeration. Using smaller pieces of moss with perlite is sort of my own addition to this method. I feel like it makes repotting easier while trying to tease out the moss from the roots. You can also use regular pieces of perlite instead of fine pieces, but I often have quite a bit left over from sifting bonsai soil, and I figure I might as well use it for something so it doesn't all go to waste. So now, I sift all of the dust out and include all the fines in my air layers every year, and it has worked out pretty well for me. Once it is mostly full, I like to add a layer of pure sphagnum moss to the top. It usually helps in retaining moisture through the summer. And if we ever go through days or weeks with a lot of rain, I have the option to remove the top layer of moss so that the layer has a better chance to dry out some. Where I live, we usually get more hot, dry weather than too much rain in summer, so I usually don't have a need to remove it. Alright, this one's all set. Next, I'll test air layering this larger branch, which had been chewed on by a deer the year before. It managed to grow new buds after it was damaged, and after I pruned this year's candles off, it's left with very little foliage. So it'll be interesting to see if this thing roots. So again, I'll cut a ring of bark off, make the vertical slits into the bark, add the rooting hormone to the slits in the upper part of the ring, fit the pot around the cut, making sure the cut is positioned near the center of the pot. Add my stopper wire to keep it all from sliding down. Close up the pot. Add the moss or whatever rooting medium you choose. Make sure it's pressed in firmly. And I'll finish it off with a layer of pure sphagnum moss. And there they are, all finished up and ready to take root. As I mentioned before, you'll want to keep a close eye on the moisture levels on your air layers through the summer. The goal would be to try to make sure they aren't constantly waterlogged, but also don't dry out completely in the summer heat, or else the young roots that are just forming could be damaged. Sometimes the sphagnum moss will be nearly without moisture on the top and sides. When you go to water, it'll be so dry that it'll actually repel the water and will need to be rewatered several times in order for it to fully soak in. This happens to me occasionally, and I find that gently pressing on the sphagnum moss while I'm watering helps it soak in better, kind of like a sponge. Also, as a side note, if monitoring the moisture levels of the air layers daily doesn't seem feasible over the next few months, I'm sure you could use the typical bag method instead of a pot. I personally haven't had the best success with bags with air layers. For me, they seem to collect water too much, resulting in root rot issues, but it totally can be done. You could, in fact, even do the pot method and wrap a bag around the pot if you won't be there to add water when hot, dry weather is expected. Now, it's only a matter of time before the layers push new buds and resume growing. Here we are just 2.5 weeks later, and we're already seeing the layers sending out new buds or a second flush of growth all around the area where the candles were cut. The bigger branch is forming new buds as well. As you can see here, I made a couple extra air layers the same day, off camera. This one's got 4 or so new buds so far, not bad. And the last one has about 8 popping out. Pretty good so far. I'm not really sure if cutting off the candles or the first flush is completely necessary. It seems to help in creating lower branching for bonsai, which is what Muranaka's blog is centered around. And it also worked for me in rooting over a dozen air layers thus far, so I'll continue with it for now. I couldn't find any more video updates on the layers performed in the video, which was in 2023. Luckily, I filmed some progress clips of my layers from the year before, which should give you an idea of how things should look. Here's a clip of my layers from that year after 2 months, where the new shoots had extended quite a bit. Some are a few inches long and are pushing out some new needles. Right there's the point where the first flush was cut 2 months prior. These 2 air layers here are actually both double air layers. They aren't quite as vigorous as the previous one, they were just a bit behind. They caught up and still ended up rooting just fine though. Okay, jumping ahead another month, the new shoots are a little bigger as well as the length of the needles. As you'll see, the purpose of this clip was to try and show how the rooting was coming along, which, I have to say, was progressing nicely. Given that it was mid-August and we still had roughly 6 weeks of warm weather left, I was confident these air layers would be sufficiently rooted by autumn. Here's a thick root running along the side on this one. There were more, but it was hard to open up the pots enough to really see inside there without the moss crumbling apart. Layer number 2 was rooting good, with some even poking out the side of the pot. And finally, number 3 are some fine roots on this side. On the other side, there were fine roots everywhere, especially some thicker ones along the bottom of the pot. Number 2 and 3 were rooted better than the first, but then again, they were double air layers, so twice the roots. Alright, now we are in the first week of October here, and the air layers are finally ready to harvest. I'll cut them off the tree, and you can either leave them as is in these pots all winter, somewhere protected like an unheated garage, or you can pot them up to a slightly bigger pot where you will need to make sure they are just slightly moist all winter. In this clip, we are back to the air layers performed earlier in the video from 2023. It is now late April 2024, and there is some new growth happening up top as well as new root growth. This is the first one filmed in the video. It has a nice amount of roots and is ready for a repotting. The bigger air layer seems to be doing okay. It has a vigorous birch seedling growing from it. Most of the roots you see here are actually from the birch and not the pine, so I'm going to have to separate these two for sure. And here are the other two air layers that were done off camera. Everything looks good. Time to put them in their new pots for the growing season. I'll start by raking the moss out of the roots. This has to be done carefully or else too many roots will be torn off. As I said earlier, having chopped moss with perlite added makes this process a lot easier. Some roots will be torn off, it's just going to happen. The idea is to get the majority of the sphagnum moss out of the root ball so that it doesn't hold on to too much moisture after you repot it, whether it be in bonsai soil, potting soil, or planted in the ground. The air layers have started coming out of dormancy, and I probably should have done this a couple weeks earlier, but repotting now is still doable. Now I've got most of the moss out of the roots. This part is optional, but I'm going to cut the remaining stem left over from the branch. This is the pot I'm going to use, or should I say colander, with a piece of wood added to the bottom to help stabilize it. In theory, it should help in forming fine feeder roots, which will be good for bonsai development. I found these colanders at a dollar store and were very cheap, so I figured I'd try them out. The soil that I'm using is a mix of lava rock, zeolite, perlite, pine bark, and a little peat moss with added mycorrhiza. Whatever soil you choose, just make sure it is relatively well draining. For added stability, I'm wiring the tree into the pot for now. This is totally optional, but I recommend something to keep it stable for a few months. After adding the rest of the soil, it's time to give it a good watering. Next, I did the big air layer and found out it had in fact rooted only in one little area. I decided to take a chance and go ahead and pot it up anyway. We'll see if it makes it this year. Where I live in Zone 6, we have cold winters that will inevitably freeze and kill any roots there may be on the air layers left exposed to the elements. For those in warmer climates, leaving the air layers of Japanese black pine on throughout the winter might be an option. One year, I accidentally left my first separated air layers outside at night as it got down to 17 degrees Fahrenheit. Fortunately, it went unaffected and ended up surviving the rest of the winter in an unheated garage. Here is a picture of all 4 air layers from 2023 potted up and ready to go. I will keep them in a good bit of full sun through the day and continue to treat them as I would as my other pre-bonsai. I hope this video was helpful in demonstrating how to air layer Japanese black pine in just a few months. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave me a comment. I would be glad to answer them the best I can. And subscribe if you would like to see an update on these Japanese black pine air layers that I just did last week. I'd like to end the video with some photos of my previous successful air layers over the last couple years. Thanks for watching.